Chapter 22. Space, Time, and Wisdom. The Western type of consciousness may be said to have begun, as we saw at the end of Chapter 15, with the emergence of Greek thought from the Orient. For the Western outlook is based essentially on that turning of man's attention to the phenomena, which in this book has been called alpha thinking. This is sharply contrasted with the Oriental impulse, still heard echoing on in Plato, to refrain from the phenomena, to remain, as it were, in the bosom of the eternal, to disregard as irrelevant to man's true being all that, in his experience, which is based on the contacts of the senses. Oriental philosophy, hardly distinguishable from Oriental theology, is based above all on a determination to regard the sense world as Maya, or illusion. It was for this reason that on its rediscovery in the 19th century, it made such a strong appeal to the few who were by then becoming dimly aware that the enlightenment of the West is based on idolatry. It is clear, however, that the way of the West lies not back, but forward, not in withdrawal from the contacts of the senses, but in their transformation and redemption. We have also seen that the rise and growth of alpha thinking was associated with a change in man's experience of space. It was with difficulty that movement, and particularly movement in a circle, was first wholly distinguished from mental activity, and this applied especially to the celestial revolutions, which were approached in a way that suggests that what we call space was conceived rather as a kind of undifferentiated, all-enclosing continuum or mental mobile, for which perhaps wisdom is the best modern word we can find. Space, as a mindless, wisdomless, lifeless void, was not a common notion at any time before the scientific revolution. Thus, at the close of Chapter 11, we saw how the experience of space differed from our own, even as recently as medieval times. To the remnant of participation which then still survived, man, as microcosm, was placed at the center of the macrocosm. But the point was that he was an organic center. The spatial aspect of the relation was incidental. It is only when space itself has become an idol, when it has become simply the absence of phenomena, conceived in the phenomenal mode, that perspective takes the place of participation. For the mode of vision which perspective reproduces, each pair of eyes is placed at the center of a purely spatial sphere, and any organic relation there may be is incidental. If, therefore, we should wish to revive in ourselves the faculty of experiencing spatial form as representation, and if we should wish to seek assistance in doing so from the past history of man, we shall do well to look backwards to the east, along the path that led through the Greeks to the scientific revolution. We have seen, however, that there is another line along which we can also look back to the same source. In Chapter 16, we saw that, long before the alpha thinking of the Greeks had begun its long task of eliminating participation from human consciousness, the Jewish nation, with a different impulse and a more considered purpose, had initiated the like process. In their case, there was no question of turning their attention to the phenomenon for its own sake, or at all. The killing out of participation was the end in itself, and imagery of all kinds was the quarry marked out for destruction. It has often been pointed out that we find reflected in the early literature of the Jews an entirely new feeling for the significance of history, and perhaps of time itself. It is in their apocalypses that we first detect a conception of history as something which had a beginning and is moving towards an end. The apocalypses have even been pointed to as the earliest example of something that could be called a doctrine of evolution. It has perhaps not been so often remarked that a peculiar sense of the significance and shape of time is also reflected in the Hebrew language. Not only, for example, does the Hebrew verb possess no present tense, as we understand it in the Aryan languages, the past being used for every moment up to the present, and the future for every moment from the present on. Not only is this the case, but the past and future are interchangeable in ways which it is difficult for us to understand. More than one Hebrew grammarian, for instance, has declared that the past tense was used for prophecy and the future for history. Once again, we notice a sharp contrast with what had gone before. The Oriental conception of time was essentially cyclic. The picture was one of eternal repetition rather than of beginning, progress, and end, and the path of the individual soul to the bosom of eternity was a backward path of extrication from the wheels of desire in which it had allowed itself to become involved. To reach or to resume the supreme identity with Brahma, with the eternal, was the object, and its achievement was a matter which lay directly between the individual and the eternal. The Semitic way, on the other hand, was a way forward through history, and it was a way shared indeed by the individual, but trodden by the nation as a whole. In a study such as this, which necessarily attempts to cover a great deal of ground in a very short space, one should be aware of overstressing a resemblance to make a neat parallel. But I think it is true to say that just as by looking back through the Greek mind, we bring to life the apprehension of form in space as an image or representation, so by looking back through the Jewish mind, we bring to life the apprehension of form in time, that is, of events themselves as images, whether of the past or future, or of a state of mind. The second is a far more difficult achievement for us than the first. But I believe that anyone who would well consider the way of experiencing Old Testament history, which is implied in the Psalms and in the Jewish liturgy, and then again in Christian art before the Reformation, would understand what I mean. To immerse oneself in the medieval mystery plays and in those sequences and parallels between Old and New Testament, which are the very backbone, the essential formal principle of the cathedral sculptures, is to feel that, in one most real sense, the Old Testament was lost with the Reformation. For non-participating consciousness, it is either or. A narrative is either a historical record or a symbolical representation. It cannot be both. And the prefigurings of the New Testament in the Old, and the whole prophetic element in the Old Testament, is now apt to be regarded as moonshine. In a parallel sphere, however, the life history of the individual man, it is already no longer taken quite so confidently for granted that the historical and the symbolical are contradictories. In the 19th century, it required the powerful imagination of a John Keats to perceive that every man's life is a perpetual allegory. In our own day, the development of psychology alone has made this possible for much more ordinary men. Though not many agree with him, a man is no longer regarded as a lunatic who divines that the things which happen to a person, and the order in which they happen, may be as much a part of him as his physical organism. And it seems to lie in the natural order of things that, with the future increase of final participation, this perception should be extended to the biographies of nations and races and of humanity as a whole. All things considered, before we reject out of hand the possibility of any imaginal principle in time and the events of history, we should do well to consider how we are getting on with our own conception of both time and space. The concept of space as an unlimited or three-dimensional void, a kind of extrapolated perspective, which came in with the disappearance of participation, is still, of course, the ordinary man's concept. It held good for science, too, until the end of the 19th century. The indications that it is now proving inadequate are so numerous that I do not need to stress them. When, for instance, we are told that space must be conceived as spherical, or asked to think in terms of a space-time continuum, we can hardly avoid the conclusion that the old, or rather the still young, idol of infinity as a going on forever, whether in space or time, is showing unmistakable signs of strain. There seems to be a strong tendency, both in dealing with the periphery and in dealing with the center of the physical universe, to substitute what are in effect thought patterns for plausible and seriously supposed spatial apparatus. Is not the rather hectic picture of a universe expanding in all directions with almost infinite rapidity in essence a geometrical rather than a physical notion? I am told at all events that it bears a marked resemblance to projective geometry. It appears, said Lord Russell, broadcasting in April 1955 on the death of Einstein, that the universe is of finite size, although unbounded. Do not attempt to understand this unless you have studied non-Euclidean geometry. It appears also that the universe is continually getting bigger. We turn from the periphery to the infinitesimal center of our perspectivized space, and we hear the same voice in the same broadcast assuring us that nobody before quantum theory doubted that at any given moment a particle is at some definite place and moving with some definite velocity. This is no longer the case. The more accurately you determine the place of a particle, the less accurate will be its velocity, and the more accurately you determine the velocity, the less accurate will be its position. And the particle itself has become something quite vague, not a nice little billiard ball as it used to be. When you think you have caught it, it produces a convincing alibi as a wave and not a particle. In fact, you know only certain equations of which the interpretation is obscure. The reader will be aware that in this book I have called that something quite vague by the name either of the particles or of the unrepresented, and have then, for reasons given, largely dismissed it from consideration. This is perhaps the place to say a final word about it. Physical science postulates an unrepresented as a something which is independent of our consciousness in a way or to an extent to which the phenomena are not. Our consciousness is, however, not independent of it, for it is in response to its stimulus that our senses and our figuration and thinking together construct the phenomenal world. It has, however, lately been growing apparent that all attempts to conceive the unrepresented in terms of idle matter in idle space and idle time breaking down. Approaching it this way, we learn only that by taking it up into mathematical equations, we can produce startling technological results. Two consequences seem to follow. Firstly, it would be rash to assume that there is no other approach than the mathematical one. Who can confirm, and on what evidence, that we may not also learn to approach the unrepresented by way of enhancing our figuration, so as to make it a conscious process as well as by the path of mathematical hypothesis? For sensation and figuration are the, at present unconscious, moment in which we actually meet the unrepresented, or at least encounter its resistance, in experience as distinct from applying alpha thinking to it afterwards. In this way, we should gradually eliminate the unrepresented by rendering it phenomenal. It, too, would take its place among the collective representations. We should then at least find out whether what I have said about the phenomena can, or cannot, in the last resort, be applied to the as yet unrepresented also. That is to say, whether or no they are representations of the collective unconscious. Certainly the something quite vague, which can be coaxed into producing an atomic explosion, does not look much like a collective unconscious. But then neither did the represented, which underlies the ordinary appearances, look like one, until we started thinking seriously about them. Secondly, it would be rash to dismiss out of hand that different and essentially representational conception of time and space which I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. Which of the two is the cul-de-sac and which is the highway? Whether it is more practical and straightforward, and whether the human mind is likelier to get somewhere by thinking of man as surrounded by a cosmos or sphere of wisdom, or by trying to think that emptiness is spherical and of finite size, although unbounded and getting bigger, are questions which everyone will decide for himself. It is, at all events, the former conception, as the reader will by now be aware, upon which the whole argument of this book converges, and from now on I shall assume its validity. We may think of the cosmic wisdom as related to the appearances rather as, in men, the inner unspoken word, the verbum cordis, verbum intellectus, of which Aquinas wrote, is related to the word vox, that is actually vocalized. At least it is only on some such basis that we can ever hope to understand such a phenomenon as the history and literature of the Jews, or its culmination in Christianity, in a way which does not simply cut us off from the accumulated wisdom and insight of the past. In chapter 16, something was said of the part played by the Jewish impulse in the development of the Western world. If we would go farther and consider its place in the whole history of man, we can, I believe, best do so by reflecting on the nature of memory. Just as, when a word is formed or spoken, the original unity of the inner word is polarized into a duality of outer and inner, that is, of sound and meaning. So, when man himself was uttered, that is, created, the cosmic wisdom became polarized, in and through him, into the duality of appearance and intelligence, representation and consciousness. But when creation has become polarized into consciousness on the one side and phenomena or appearances on the other, memory is made possible and begins to play an all-important part in the process of evolution. For by means of his memory, man makes the outward appearances in inward experience. He acquires his self-consciousness from them. When I experience the phenomena in memory, I make them mine, not now by virtue of any original participation, but by my own inner activity. It is from this activity in memory, it will be recalled, that the human word, according to Aquinas, proceeds. For, once the phenomena are mine, I can reproduce them in the form of words. Thus, the human word, for Aquinas, as we saw in chapter 13, proceeds from the memory, as the divine word proceeds from God the Father. We shall understand the place of the Jews in the history of the earth, that is, of man as a whole, when we see the children of Israel occupying the position in that history which memory occupies in the composition of an individual man. The Jews, with their language trailing vestiges of the world's creator and their special awareness of history, were the dawning memory in the human race. They too tore the phenomena from their setting of original participation and made them inward with intent to re-utter them from within as word. They cultivated the inwardness of the represented. They pinpointed participation to the divine name, the I am, spoken only from within, and it was the logic of their whole development that the cosmos of wisdom should henceforth have its perennial source. Not without and behind the appearances, but within the consciousness of man, and not in front of his senses and his figuration, but behind them. Chapter 23. Religion. When one ventures to speak, as I did in Chapter 19, of man standing in a directionally creator relation to the phenomena, it is clear that a theological issue is raised. Religion is essentially an I-thou relation between man on the one hand and the creator of man and his phenomena on the other. A man who cannot think of his creator as a being other than himself cannot be said to have a religion. This is a truth of which modern theology, in its reaction against the vague creative evolutionism which sometimes passed muster as religion in the 19th century, is very much and very healthily aware. Unfortunately, it is just on the interpretation and application of this all-important truth that our modern idolatry has fastened its claws. For idolatry has coarsened the very meaning of otherness, the very way in which other and same can be thought. We have seen in Chapter 13 how distinctions not determined by the senses were once concrete experiences, before they faded away into the frigidity of subjective ideas with the coming of the scientific revolution. We have seen, for instance, how Schiller was unable to conceive that Goethe's Erscheinungen could be anything at all unless it was either a phenomenon perceivable by the passive senses or an abstract idea. So, to the typical modern mind fixed firm in its idolatry, unless God is thought of as not merely other than itself, but other in the phenomenal mode, and after the manner in which the idols are other, God must be merely an idea. Yet this can be no more than a passing blindness. Once it was remembered, and someday it will be realized afresh, that the soul is in a manner all things, God the Father is not less but more other from me than are the phenomena. But if I think of him as other in the same mode as the phenomena, then I substitute an idol for him. And if I then proceed to worship him, as so thought of, then whatever I may say about it, in the secret recesses of my soul, I am worshipping perhaps some kind of guardian angel, certainly not my Creator. In order to be sure of distinguishing him numerically from myself, and in the name of humility, I have dared to think of him as an existence parallel with my own. Herein lies the idolatry which infects contemporary religion. We saw in Chapter 16 how the willed ousting of participation, which was the paramount impulse or obedience of the Jews, could contribute to the same result as did the alpha thinking of the Greeks and their successors. But we saw also how a waxing experience of the inwardness of the divine name was the proper counterpole to their loss of original participation. We stopped short, however, of the point where this experience was lost. By the time Jesus was born, the divine name had ceased to be spoken by man in the temple or elsewhere. The Pharisees had made it the name of a being essentially objective, remote, inaccessible, infinitely superior to, yet imagined as existentially parallel with man. Thus the Jews had barely glimpsed, before they again lost sight of, that which is the opposite pole to man's otherness from the I am, namely, his supreme identity with it. The fixing of such a gulf between God and man was not fatal to religion so long as some measure of the original participation remained. To a participating consciousness, apprehending the world and the Word as image, many nouns are the names of the Creator, non propri sed similitudinem, and the noun God is merely one of them. To a non-participating consciousness, apprehending the world as object, most nouns are the names of idols, and the noun God can be no exception. If the noun God were indeed the divine name, it would not frequently appear in discourse as the subject of easy and familiar sentences. Whereas, in fact, it is long now since this liberty became almost the recognized mark by which we distinguish the sermon from other forms of utterance. The progressive loss of original participation necessarily involves one of the two alternatives: either an ever-increasing experience of the inwardness of the divine name and the divine presence, which is the religious aspect of what I have called final participation, or an ever-increasing idolatry in religion as elsewhere. This dilemma I believe to be the ultimate and innermost significance of Protestantism, the development of which has been roughly contemporary with that of the scientific revolution. For the idolatry of which I have just written is, of course, not the whole story. In many corners, in many movements, both within and without the established churches, a new impulse towards final participation has gathered strength, as men have attempted to make the Pauline maxim, "Not I, but Christ in me," a living experience. "Though God be everywhere present," wrote William Law, author of The Serious Call, "yet he is only present to thee in the deepest and most central part of thy soul. Thy natural senses cannot possess God, or unite thee to him, nay, thy inward faculties of understanding, will, and memory can only reach after God, but cannot be the place of his habitation in thee. But there is a root or depth in thee, from whence all these faculties come forth, as lines from a center, or as branches from the body of the tree. This depth is called the center, the fund or bottom of the soul. This depth is the unity, the eternity. I had almost said the infinity of thy soul, for it is so infinite that nothing can satisfy it or give it any rest but the infinity of God." This, on the one side, and on the other that valiant attempt which began with the Reformation and ended in fundamentalism, to understand and accept literally, and only literally, the words of the Bible, precisely while their meanings were being subtly drained away by idolatry. These are the opposite and complementary poles between which Protestantism has hitherto revolved. If this book has succeeded in showing anything, it has shown that the only possible answer to the idolatry with which all our thinking today is infected is the acceptance and conscious ensuing of that directionally creator relation to the phenomenal world, which we know to be a fact, whether we like it or not. Is God's creation less awe-inspiring because I know that the light, for instance, out of which its visual substance is woven, streams forth from my own eyes? "Look upon the rainbow," wrote the author of Ecclesiastes. "Look upon the rainbow and praise him that made it. Very beautiful it is in the brightness thereof. It compasseth the heavens about with a glorious circle, and the hands of the Most High have bended it." Do I echo these words less warmly when I recollect that Greek word is creating the rainbow through my eyes? When I know that to think otherwise is an illusion or a pretense? Does piety depend on original participation? If so, one thing is certain: there is no future for it. But fortunately, it does not. I did not create my eyes, and if an understanding of the manner of my participation in the appearance of a rainbow does not diminish my awe before its creator, why should that be the case with the other more palpable phenomena? What but idolatry could ever make me suppose it was the case? "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me." I did not create my eyes. But we saw at the beginning of this book how, in order that the world of appearances may arise, It is not enough for the senses alone to be added to the unrepresented. That world depends no less on man's figuration, and, with that, also on his imagination. It is because imagination participates the creative activity in this way that it has itself been dimly felt to be, and described as, creative. We saw in chapter 21 how this means that the future of the phenomenal world can no longer be regarded as entirely independent of man's volition. This is the difference between original and final participation. This is also a conclusion from which piety may shrink. We must then ask ourselves, apart altogether from our obligation to accept the truth because it is true, whether we ought to shrink from the notion that we are to share the responsibility of maintaining an earth which it has already, it seems, been given into our hands to destroy. Moreover, has history any real significance unless, in the course of it, the relation between creature and creator is being changed? God's view is the view of mind as such, for it corresponds to the real structure of existence. The tendency of any mind, in proportion as it overcomes its creaturely limitations, must be to gravitate towards the divine center and share the divine view of things. That is the goal. It cannot be the starting point. Has history any significance unless we can apply these words to the whole development of the mind of man? Would it not be wiser, instead of shrinking, to recall the words of St. Paul? For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. And the German poet Novalis' gloss, man is the Messiah of nature? On the other hand, it may be objected that all this talk of the relation of man to the phenomenal world is cold stuff, having little or nothing to do with religion, whose field is the soul and its salvation. But this watertight attitude is itself a product of idolatry. What the psalmist wrote of the old idols is true no less of the idols of the 20th century. They that make them are like unto them. The soul is in a manner all things, and the idols we create are built into the souls of our children, who learn more and more to think of themselves as objects among objects, who grow hollower and hollower. In the long run, we shall not be able to save souls without saving the appearances. And it is an error fraught with the most terrible consequences to imagine that we shall. Let us not, nevertheless, be unduly oppressed by the fear of losing all we are accustomed to, whether it be that delight in a wholly independent world of nature of which I spoke in chapter 21, or of some special brand of piety that depends on it. But let us make no mistake as to the magnitude of the moral demand which is made on us. In that respect, there is no need for the moralist to worry. It is not such cold stuff after all. The world of final participation will one day sparkle in the light of the eye as it never yet sparkled early one morning in the original light of the sun. But the coming of this light presupposes a goodness of heart and a steady furnace in the will, which have only not been emphasized in this book because they are not the subject of it. The morality of imagination is subtle and deep and far-reaching. Subtle above all, because imagination itself is still in its tender infancy. I have already pointed out that imagination and goodness are not synonymous. But I believe that, if we are sensitive to it, we may divine in this age a very close and special relation between them. This relation was the guiding intuition of that great confused spirit, the very St. George of iconoclasm, William Blake, who held that imagination is the cardinal virtue, because the literalness which supports idolatry is the besetting sin of the age which is upon us. but we must walk warily here. It is in the nature of the case that, if at any point in time something like a new moral demand is made on humanity, moral judgments grow for a time double and confused. Thus, in chapter 29, I spoke of certain symptoms of iconoclasm in the shape of a new willingness to apprehend symbolically. If I now maintain that these have a moral significance, and indeed a paramount moral significance, I am at once in the difficulty that the scale of values I have set up not only does not correspond with the generally accepted scale of Christian moral values, but appears to cut right across it. There are plenty of people with a natural taste for dream psychology, or for art or literature of a symbolical nature, for sacramentalism in religion, or for other things whose meaning cannot be grasped without a movement of the imagination, who are arrogant or self-centered, or in other ways no better than they should be. And conversely, there are prosaic, humdrum, literal souls before whose courage and goodness we are abashed. It is not a happy task to have to maintain that, from one point of view, and that an all-important one, the former must be accounted morally superior. But, then, neither would it have been a happy task to have to maintain, let us say, to a disciple of Rabbi Hillel, that from one point of view, and that an all-important one, some of the more raffish members of St. Paul's congregation at Corinth possessed the one thing needful which the rabbi lacked. The needful virtue is that which combats the besetting sin. And the besetting sin today is the sin of literalness, or idolatry. Relative moral values are not as simple as relative places in class at school. There is a tragedy of progress. And yet, in neither case, perhaps, to a fine and sincere moral intuition, is the apparent irrelevance as total as I have just suggested. The relation between the mind and heart of man is a delicate mystery, and hardness is catching. It will, I believe, be found that there is a valid connection, at some level, however deep, between what I have called literalness and a certain hardness of heart. Listen attentively to the response of a dull or literal mind to what insistently presents itself as allegory or symbol, and you may detect a certain irritation, a faint, incipient aggressiveness in its refusal. Here, I think, is a deep-down moral gesture. You may, for instance, hear the literal man object suspiciously that he is being got at. And this is quite correct. He is, just as he is being got at by his unconscious through the symbolism of his dreams. An attempt is being made, of which he is dimly aware, to undermine his idols, and his feet are being invited on to the beginning of the long road which in the end must lead him to self-knowledge, with all the unacceptable humiliations which that involves. Instinctively he does not like it. He prefers to remain literal. But of course he hardly knows that he prefers it, since self-knowledge is the very thing which he is avoiding. We could pursue the matter further and instance on the positive side, a certain humble, tender receptiveness of heart, which is nourished by a deep and deepening imagination, and by the self-knowledge which that inevitably involves. Perhaps this is what Blake had in mind when he called imagination the divine body of the Lord Jesus, blessed forever. But we have digressed too far already from the main road. One final word, however, before we leave the specifically moral aspect behind us. It may be objected that however true it may be, all that I have been saying is much too difficult to have much to do with the religion of ordinary men. This is not an objection which would have appealed to St. Augustine, or the Fathers of the Church, but let us consider it. In the first place, A great deal of the complexity of my argument is due to the deep-seated error, with its consequently innumerable ramifications, which that argument has sought to unravel. The movements of fingers disentangling a crumpled skein are complicated, but the final result is not complicated. Secondly, from one point of view, God is always simple, as the light is simple, and the simplest soul can turn to him at whatever point it stands in the matter of education or wisdom. But from another, since he is everywhere present, he must at least be as complicated as the most complicated thing in his creation. God's view is the view of mind as such, and outside idolatry, we cannot really separate his view of creation from creation itself, except as the persons of the Trinity are separate. There is, moreover, a topical application of this truth. In the industrial and urbanized civilization of today, many of the simple minds which meet with indifference or with indignant protest any suggestion of difficulty or complexity in theology are not so simple when it comes to the tackling of complexities of the phenomenal world in nature or machinery. The relation between the mind and heart of man is indeed a close and delicate one, and any substantial cleft between the two is unhealthy and cannot long endure. Hence, however, the case may stand for the time being, or with a few individuals here and there, it is certain that the mind of man as a whole cannot safely be left to occupy itself with idols, while a moral or even an adoring ghost in the machine responds to the otherness of God with love and obedience and the cultivation of self-improvement. There will be a revival of Christianity when it becomes impossible to write a popular manual of science without referring to the incarnation of the world. It is in these books, not popular theology, however excellently and simply it is written, as today it often is, on which the mind of the proletariat seizes as it awakens from its ancient peasant dreaming and peasant wisdom. It is these, especially if they are laced with Marxism, which the needy Oriental student in Bloomsbury devours and takes home with him. It is these which up to now are the answering legacy of the West to the East, whence she once derived her religion. The hungry sheep look up and are not fed. But Marxism forges ahead, because the scientific outlook, which is in the blood of the proletariat, because it is in the collective representations to which they are awakening, is part and parcel of its message. Whereas to Christian doctrine, as now presented, it is at worst a stumbling block, and at best totally irrelevant. I have tried to show in this book that it is in fact very far from irrelevant, inasmuch as the scientific revolution marked a crucial stage in that evolution from original to final participation, which is the progressive incarnation of the Word. I have tried to show that the phenomena cannot be understood in their true nature without an understanding of precisely that evolution. In a letter to The Times last year concerning the evangelical mission of Dr. Graham, the Bishop of Plymouth, wrote, "Our Lord constantly emphasized in his healing ministry to the whole man, if he is not the Lord of our minds, he is not the Savior whom this generation, which is our immediate concern, so sorely needs." I am persuaded that in our time the battle between the powers of good and evil is pitched in man's mind even more than in his heart, since it is known that the latter will ultimately follow the former. In the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, the Logos, or Word, is one of the three persons. The conception of a threefold nature in the Godhead is not, however, peculiar to Christianity. It is to be found also in Oriental religions, and is perhaps the formal principle underlying the whole complicated organism of Greek mythology. It is the depth of all theology. What is peculiar to Christianity is the nexus which that acknowledges between the second person of the Trinity and a certain historical event in time. For the Christian, accordingly, religion can never be simply the direct relation between his individual soul and the eternal Trinity. As long as we ourselves are occupying a standpoint in time, so long, interposed between the first and third persons, all history, in a manner, lies. Not to realize to the uttermost the otherness of God from ourselves is to deny the Father. But equally, not to strive to realize the sameness, to renege from the supreme identity, is to deny the Holy Spirit. This any deeply religious man may feel, whatever terminology he may have learned to employ. To this a true Christian, or so it seems to me, must add, in no way to relate the former with the past, and the latter with the future of the world, is to seek to deprive history, and perhaps time itself, of all religious significance.